Hello again, everyone. I am tremendously excited to be here, to be doing this. Before we begin, I would like to thank Spirit. I would like to thank our ancestors. I would like to thank all of you who have been with us throughout the last few days that we've delved into a variety of topics. This has been, folks have used terms like reparative, transformative, dynamic. I'm so excited for that and by that. I am Dr. Nadejda Webb, and I will be moderating today's keynote. I'm taking a deep breath, and I just want to thank Spirit again, because this truly has been transformative in so many different ways. And we thank our ancestors for so many reasons. And we know that without them, we would not be here. This work would not be possible. And this work is truly done in their name. All right. I would first like to welcome to the stage Dorothy Berry, digital curator for the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, whose work has focused on the intersections of information discovery and African American history. I would now like to welcome Professor Jennifer Morgan, Professor of History in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis at New York University, and author of the prize-winning Reckoning with Slavery, Gender Kinship, and Capitalism in the Early Black Atlantic and Laboring Women, Gender and Reproduction in the Making of New World Slavery. I would now like to welcome Bilphena Yahwon, founder of Archive Liberia, a memory project aimed at reconstructing her personal memories and the memories of other Liberians. I feel, I'm so excited. I met Bilphena in this space about 2 years ago, and we were doing work with New Generation Scholars, and so it feels like such a wonderful moment. So yes, let's welcome them again before we dive in. Okay. To start the conversation, I would like to begin with Dorothy Berry. And you begin your essay, The House the Archives Built, with a picture of William Berry, circa 1880, on the porch of the house he built in 1873. And as we've been talking about data, as we've been talking about Black folks and data, I wonder about family, kinship, network. And I wonder if you would tell us why you chose to start with not just some information about him, but an image of him.
I wanted to make the connection to the house. So he's on the porch of the house that he built in 1873. I think they also built one in 1872, but that burned down. So second house. And that's the house that I lived in from age 10 to 18, but then I came back for summers in college. So I lived there for quite a while. And it's the house that my parents lived in. And Wallace is buried in the backyard. There's a slave cemetery. So I wanted to make it really clear that when I'm talking about these archives, because then the essay gets maybe more metaphorical and wordy, that I am talking about concrete things that I am related to. It also served for me as a sort of positionality statement to contextualize who I am to people that don't know me when I'm talking about Black archives. That this is the family I'm talking about, this is who I am. I come from a archive studies, but also a musicological background, and so I came up with the teaching of starting your ethnographies with your positionalities so that people can know what your interpretive lens is. Yeah. And so much scholarship about Black people is not by Black people, or is by Black people that are perhaps not related in terms of class, ethnicity, various things, nationality, to the people they're studying. So in that moment, I wanted to say, I may not be someone who you think of as like a, classic Ozarks country girl, but this is who I am. This is my lineage. And afterwards with other people, I'm like, I also have pictures of my mom's great-grandpa. It just wasn't relevant to the story, but there's more than one angle here.
Thank you. Thank you for that. As you were speaking, I now think about Black archival practice. And Black archival practice as a relationship to evidence that recognizes Black humanity and complexity. It is concerned with history, memory, and community vitality. I also think about Faith Day's Black Data booklet, where she says that there's a purpose for Black data, and it lives outside of the academic economy, for instance, one point that she makes. And I wonder, Bilphena, we were both nodding, so please dive in. But I wonder, Bilphena, as someone who works directly with the community, whose work is very much interested in enabling community archiving, and enabling folks to excavate, to find things in their home, in the basement, in the attic, what do you say now?
Yeah, so I think last year, I'm from Liberia, West Africa. My family came to the US in 2001 as refugees as a result of our civil wars. And as part of that journey is coming with nothing, right? Quite literally, we came with the clothes that we were wearing. I have no photographs to point to what my mother looked like when she was a child, no documents of my grandparents, great-grandparents. Quite honestly, the evidence of my ancestors' lives are truly housed within us. We don't have anything, right, to point to that. And so last year, while I was in Liberia, my mother took me to visit where I was born. I was born in Phoebe Hospital, which is located in Swakoko, Bon County, Liberia, right? And my mother tells my birth story by saying she was actually running from a helicopter. It was during war, and she fell, which is how she went into labor. And the doctor that was there at that hospital that night had made the decision that all of the women there had to give birth because the rebels were close, right? And so he literally went from room to room delivering these babies as a way that these women would be able to escape afterwards. And my mom was one of them. And so when we went, initially she wanted me to meet him, but he had died. And what's beautiful is that he was actually buried on the hospital grounds, and that was a request that the community made and that his family honored. But one of the questions I actually went was to ask if I could find my birth card, because I wanted some kind of data on myself. I wanted to know who were the nurses in this hospital, what time was I actually born, what did his signature look like? But of course, I couldn't access that because all of that was destroyed in war, right? And so I'm coming as someone who's so much of my history I can't get on Ancestry.com. Library of Congress is not going to pull up much about my family. There is not really a lot of data or projects in which I can go to find anything on my family. That is quite literally impossible. And then the data that would have been in Liberia, a lot of it looted, a lot of it stolen, but a lot of it destroyed as a result of war, and that war comes out of imperialism, racial capitalism, and so forth. And so the reason why I invest so much of my time in community archives is to be able to say, what would it look like for us to create data structures that is outside of the bounds of institutions and capitalism, right? That cannot be within their grasp because quite literally, we are carrying it, right? It would require us, right? And I'll end by saying, I remember a few years ago at the NWSA conference, they had a Combahee River Collective there. And one of the things that they said was we wanted our work to go in the same spaces along with our bodies, right? And I think what has happened with Black data is the data goes, but the bodies don't go with them. And so for me, Archive Liberia is to force our bodies to be there because that is the only way you're going to get that data.
I wonder now if Professor Morgan would like to talk about, so in my mind, right, this is a more immediate example of a historical reality, right? Bodies and data, disruption, divorce. So I wonder if you would like to speak to that in another context.
So these conversations have been the day's conversations and then just now have been so productive for me because I've had a very different relationship to the archive in that I enter the archive to obtain the information that I'm looking for as a historian of enslaved women in the 17th and the 18th century. And I have been always frustrated by the archive. I've always felt that the archive was a place of battle and of struggle. By the same token, I have been able to enter the archive and ask different questions. What's been so fascinating here to me about these conversations is the explicit recognition that the archive has always been a place of colonial and white supremacist violence, right? We know anybody who has tried to wrestle information from the archive, whether it's about your own family or about the subjects who I have been researching for my career, which are African and African descendant women in these early modern spaces. So we know that, but to have a set of praxes on the table for us to consider that demands the possibility of a non-colonialist space, of an archive, of a data set being a place that doesn't get wound up in that violence, I find incredibly powerful. But I do want to say that sometimes you just have to fight with the archive and extract what you need.
I see you nodding, Bilphena. Would you like to respond?
Yeah, the archive is a battle. Yes, it is a battlefield. I think that I agree, and I don't think I would add too much from that. And I do agree that we get to a place where we think about what can we get out of the archives, and then what do we do with it, right? And so that's why I'm always, when I think about the question of who owns Black data, I'm always also with the question of who owns it to do what with it, right? Because I think that is key to it. So everything you said.
Thank you both. As we're speaking, Professor Morgan, well, both of you, I then returned to the idea of the fugitive archive. The fugitive archive, really Ewing's idea of the fugitive archive, where she describes, no, she's not a trained archivist, but she goes back to her aunt's house in Ohio after a flood, and she reclaims documents that are in the house. But this is only possible because there is a flood in the home. But she...
No, I said, come on, Toni Morrison.
But she reclaims hoarding as a practice that then allows her to have a relationship with her aunt that otherwise was only possible through the memories of other people, because her aunt transitioned before she could meet her. And so now I wonder about these, so yes, wrestling with the archive, but also the other possibilities that are here. For archive building, what can that look like? What examples do we have? What do we want to surface?
I think this is, for me, this is a complicated question because I can say my personal life, this is my professional life, I don't really think about this as much when I'm at home, but I deal primarily with actually existing archives. To use Michelle Caswell's term. I almost never think of the archive. So to me, I'm always pushing back on, silences in the archives, and I say, no, actually existing archives say exactly what they want to say. If this collection only has things from people that enslaved other people and no voices from the enslaved, that's not a silence. That is an active choice about what one wants to say. And what the archive says in that discrete moment is, this is what I value. And it's not an accident. And I feel like, so from my perspective working in archives, a lot of the sort of terminologies about complication, to me, deflect away from the responsibility of archives, because I've worked in institutions that then say, this is a silence in our collection. Mm-hmm. And then I think, well, I know who does acquisitions here. So it's not, that's a very passive it's a passive phrasing internally to the institution. It's not a passive phrasing when someone is doing that work and can't see themselves in the historical record. So that is always like a complicating one for me, because I feel like, I sometimes refer to the kind of bizarre wealth of records that my family somehow kept, because there's so much that is not in that article. And also the strange thing is the part of the country that I'm from, often historically referred to white man's heaven as white man's heaven, because between 1900 and 1915, an estimated 40 to 50,000 black people left that region. And if you were to talk to people that have been there for a couple of generations now, they would say there weren't black people here, because that's been erased from that local memory. So I know that I have like a very uncommonly rich relationship to that. I don't think of it as a family archive in a way, because to me, I'm thinking preservation, conservation, arrangement, and description, and access. And I care only this much about people outside of my family being able to access that material. I only care if other people that are black from that area wanted to find people that they might be related to in it. I love that. But the idea that this should be somewhere else so people can know about the Booneberry family and the Carlocks, I feel like I prefer for those folks that are there to be able to see it.
I think that so when I think about fugitivity or a fugitive archive, I think about the practice of the person who goes into the archive looking for the people that the archive has worked very carefully to omit. I think that there's a fugitive practice that everybody, that all of us who are writing the history of the enslaved are engaged in. And so when you started to say that you are uncomfortable or I can't remember the word you said, about the silences in the archive, I also get a little frustrated when we talk about the silences in the archive, because of course the archives are screaming at us, right? And what your job is, if you are somebody who's trying to unearth another set of voices, is to listen in a different register, because they're there. They just have been purposefully, the work of the archive is not to tell the story of the dispossessed. The work of the archive, historically, has been to rationalize the story of dispossession. So if you are concerned with understanding that story, then of course the archive is a very, very fertile and generative place. It just requires some fugitivity on your part, I guess. When I started to write my first book, I was told that there was no information there for me. And every archive I entered, I was told there was nothing there that would answer my questions. And once I had written and published that book, I was once introduced to a large group, like this group, many people, of graduate students. And in the introduction, it said, well, Jennifer Morgan shows that you can write a book with no evidence. Yeah, there's a lot of evidence. But what he meant, I think, was that I had written a book about enslaved women and about reproduction in the colonial period using archives that were not designed to tell me anything about that. So.
And I think that's a big part of it, is that the issues we have with these archives are not, to me, issues with, they're issues with the metaphorical archive. But when I say that, it's a discrete institution, this archive is colonial, this archive is racist, to me the answer is yes, because it's not the archive. The archive is a lower on that hierarchy. It did not invent these things. It inherited it from the people that built it and designed their organizational structure for it, and trained the people that worked there to not recognize things in the collections. I was saying to someone yesterday, sometimes you go to an archive and say, what is the material on this part of Black life? And they say, we don't have anything with that, and they're being dissembling. But more often than not, they do not know what they have. And that is, in a certain way, kind of simplifies and opens up those possibilities for Black archives. Because if the white archive that you're going to doesn't see the Blackness in its collection, you can maybe see it sometimes quite easily. Or when you want to reframe your own collecting in your own vision to tell your own story, as I'm always saying, working with catalogers and processing archivists, whatever rules that you're following are rules someone made up, and also rules that only people who have training in this know. So breaking them is actually a very low bar. If you're like, I have to use this Library of Congress subject heading, I know it's problematic, but I don't have time to submit through the funnel to go to the approval process, people don't know what subject headings are. Don't use it. Use a different one and write down that you did it. End of story.
I was just going to say, I think that the powerful thing about that is, of course, the example that we've seen over the past 2 days is that you can make new rules. When you are building data sets, you can make new rules. You can make people's lives visible. You can disrupt the Library of Congress headings. You can disrupt the tools of retrieval so that the lives of the people that we care about are accessible to us. So if you can build it in the wrong way, that means we can build it in the right way.
And also importantly, that's not a new practice. That's not a digital practice. That's not a data practice. That is the practice of people who have been trying to make Black collections and Black archives accessible to Black people specifically. This Laura Helton quote that I really love and been saying all the time lately. Black archives, not archives of Blackness. But that work has been happening in many ways, but it's not documented for reasons related often to gender. A lot of librarians doing this work were women, and also perhaps fugitivity, a word that maybe I don't know how to use it right, but the fugitivity of those women doing those moves which broke rules in a way that they could subsume into a feminine passivity and thereby not necessarily be told they can't break those rules.
Yeah, I think part of it, and that I love you all touched on, is the actual understanding of the people behind archives. And for a long time, I always leaned on other folks' archives, and whether it was digital, in person, and so forth. And this past year, I've been at the Afro as their processing archives, processing fellow, actually getting an opportunity to be in the labor of arranging lives and arranging these histories. And something that I think I've seen and noticed more than ever being there is, truthfully, that people do not realize that there are other people who are making these archives accessible, but even more that these are people with biases in their own politics, right? Archives are not apolitical and archivists are not apolitical. Every single thing we do is a decision, right? You make a decision in if you're going to put a certain address or not. You make a decision if you're going to go far enough to decide who was the grandmother of this person or the grandfather, include that in there. You make a decision if you're going to do a little bit more research to find out where Kenlock is, right, and why it's not referred to in this article. You make a decision if you're going to say the word Palestine in your scope and description or your biographical note to point to people that there was a point in time when Black newspapers were reporting on Palestine and that genocide that is happening there. That is all a decision that you must make as an archivist, and therefore you have to build politics behind those. And so when I think about that, I also think what is missing oftentimes is this misconception that as long as a Black archivist or a Black processing archivist is doing the work, that somehow it is liberatory and the archives will serve us right and that we will arrange it the way it should be arranged. But really that's not the case, right? We understand that because Black identity politics will not save us. And so part of my pushback constantly, even for those who work within the institutions and who must deal within these more, I guess, quote unquote, legitimate archives that are structured, is what is the political work that you're constantly doing to make yourself of the people? Like, that has to be a real thing, right? And so I think I always bring that to the forefront because a huge part of how I ground Archive Liberia is I tell everyone that come into that space that I am bringing propaganda. Okay, I am bringing communist propaganda. I am bringing anti-imperialist propaganda. I am bringing anti-colonial propaganda. I am bringing propaganda in the space, and I would name it as so, and we'll ground all of the framework through that because data is not apolitical.
And it's that transparency. That transparency is so key because so many of these choices are invisible, and then researchers come into the space and view it as a flawed tabula rasa. Yes. This is somehow here in blank. But also, even to the point of the politics, the transparency is assistive because, well, two well-reasoned Black people can disagree. Yes. I get asked all the time about describing certain types of collections, and I can say this is how I do it because this is why I want to do it, but you might want to do it a different way and you would be equally right. I just know what I need to do. A lot of my work is around blackface minstrelsy and African American musical theater in the 1890s and 19-teens. So there are a lot of racial epithets that I cannot have not be visible because then I can't tell you what any of this is. Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. But also, if somebody says, I never want to put the N-word in a record, I'm not going to say they'll tell them that, no, you should. Yes. Mm-hmm. I'm going to say we should both be clear about what we do and why we do it.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So thank you all. Before we transition to questions from the audience, I want to return back to the question of community archive, or the subject of community archives. What is the potential there?
Okay, so I'm an abolitionist, so if I say something crazy, y'all don't start acting weird, okay? But what I'm gonna say is that my priority is within community archives, because I believe that as an abolitionist and as somebody that understands museums and even libraries down to the Library of Congress as sites of colonial plunder, I wonder, what does their survival look like when Black people are free? And do they survive in the way that they look, right? Because freedom also means, to me, snatching back those records and being able to do with it as we need to. Because to me, I think also when we talk about Black data sometimes, and I was just having this conversation with my partner, is I think we're so far removed at times from the fact that we're talking about lives. Like we're talking about actual people's lives. And I think about Toni Morrison. She understood memory, she said, as a reassembling the past, the Black body, right? The population of Black people. And so I think in saying that, I believe that even the concept of owning Black data is problematic. Like, owning what? What are you owning? Are you owning lives? Are you owning histories? And of course, we will be stewards of Black data, right? We can be and we should be, right? Because there are members of our communities who have been blessed to understand, how do we take care of these? How do we catalog these? And we need those skills, okay? You can't just have Black data and not know what to do with it, okay? So we have to be able to preserve them in some way. And I bring that into my family space, and I tell people things like dating your family photographs and putting the location there and figure out ways to move things from the digital and move things from the physical to the digital. So there's all of these things that we can do at home. But I think my biggest part of it is to understand that it is something that cannot be owned. And therefore, to me, community archives is where we push towards, because we want to move these things out of these institutions to me, in my humble opinion, and move it into the hands. I'll say this last thing. I was at it was a virtual symposium. There was someone there from a Benin archives. And one of the things he was talking about was, even in the places in which people believe that these artifacts from Benin was safe, he said, but we need those things within our spiritual practices. For you, it is something to be studied and cataloged and looked at and researched and admired. But for us, a very real artifact that we must use within our spiritual practices is missing. And are you telling us that you are a better caretaker of our spiritual artifacts than we are? And so that is what I mean when I say I prioritize myself with community archives, because I don't believe that there should be a group of people who is seen as better caretakers of a thing that came out of us. And so I think that's the work for me. The work is, how do we imagine
Black data and Black archives out of capitalistic structures, and how do we create structures within that imagination to take care of them, to preserve them, but to make sure that they're for and accessible to people, to revolutions, and to rebellions.
Would either of you like to respond, Professor Morgan, Dorothy?
I mean, respond. I'll say a separate thing, but she said the thing. I don't need to. I guess for me, the sort of questions goes back to this very, I don't know if it's pragmatic or if it's unimaginative, probably both, way of thinking, where I both want to center the imaginations of stewardship, the imaginaries of stewardship, and those futures. But for me also, I know I sometimes feel like I take on the burden for no one asked me to. But right now, someone does own the data.
Yes.
And it's the same thing of how do the languages that we use to empower and to represent the freedoms and humanities that we have and want to continue having in a way that's increasingly liberated against things like our material reality.
Yeah.
Someone owns the data. And should they not? That's another thing, but it's there. And it's a similar thing to, we center Black humanity in talking about enslaved people, which I am in favor of. But then when someone says to me, well, no one can own another person. And I say, yeah, but you can, legally. You can't own someone's soul, but you can have someone in a very real material sense classified as property. And it's the same thing with the sort of data question of you can't own my history, but you can somehow get all of my family photos and put them behind a paywall. And when we skip too far ahead, and I think that's sort of, that kind of phrase of we don't want to have too many poets and not enough programmers. And you definitely don't want the opposite. I prefer, if we have to pick one of the two, more poets, but you want to have that balance because the beauty of imagination should not be shut down. But we also don't need to only do site-specific installations and then the collections of the data keep growing, and we haven't challenged that growth because we have divested from it. But I also think that that's a very difficult work to commit to doing. Working in predominantly white institutions that have huge Black collections, I don't think we all need to go do that.
Yeah.
But there is also a potential real loss of that data when none of us do that.
So I'm also going to say a thing that's not the thing. I, last weekend, was at a conference honoring the work of Deborah Gray White, who published the first book-length study of enslaved women in this country in 1985, which is not that long ago for the historians in the room. And the next two books that were published came in 2004. Right? And then a few more came in 2010 in the teens. And so what I'm thinking is that the work of those of us who are trying to wrestle these stories from the archive has transformed our way of thinking. I think that everyone in this room knows something about the history of slavery now that comes out of the fact that historians have been pushing against, or have been, as I said before, wrestling in those archives, right? We have been able to change the narrative, and that scholarship is important, and that scholarship tells us that there's work to be done in those spaces, right? And so you say, the data is there, yes, somebody can put it behind a paywall, and I say, well, the National Archives in England, that's where the slave trade records are, right? And digitizing them is important, but also me being able to enter that archive and hold that ledger book in my hand while I figure out what's in it. That's also important. Yeah. And so I don't know what it means. I know what it means to think about, to answer the question of who owns Black data in the digital space. I don't know what it means to think about repositories and archives and spaces. I want more of us there, right? I want more of us training students to go there and to do the work that we need to do, and to recognize that there's work to be done there. There's so much more work to be done. I want it to, and so I guess that's, I want the development of community archive, but I also want the students and the genealogists and the people who are hungry for stories and information to be able to enter, to walk into that archive and say, I'm allowed here, you know, show me what's here.
And to know those terms, to go in and say, oh, it's really interesting that this collection would have this many ledgers from this many plantations. Mm-hmm. Can I see the provenance record?
Yeah.
I would like to see where you purchased them or who donated them.
Yeah.
Because I'm a bibliographer.
Yeah.
I love that you said that. Dr. Emmanuel, he's a land rights activist in Liberia. If you haven't seen the film The Land Beneath Our Feet, it's on Canopy. Get your library cards, get your Canopy. And one of the things that he did, he came to Wisconsin-Madison, and they have a huge Liberia archives, huge. Yes. But specifically, they had these images from Harvard's expedition, originally when they had went to see what would now become Firestone Plantation in Liberia, which is a rubber plantation. So the tires that you have, the exploitation that comes out of it, all of that. But one of the things that he said was, he went to go see those archives and was like, whoa. It completely transformed how he thought about land rights, right? Because he had never been able, but not only that, but the language that he was able to acquire, right? And so I do understand in what you both say, because there's an honor there too, right? And so what he did was he brought the archives, well, he went to Wisconsin-Madison, asked them if he could bring the archives back to Liberia, and he started this land rights initiative, which essentially they're using oral history as a way to determine who's customary land rights and who belongs to what. But he said it would not have been possible if he had not gone into that space and saw those images, and his father was able to say, no, I dug that land. That's me right there, actually. And then all the other elders in the area was like, wait, we were a part of that, right? And so there is, I do believe that there is so much to be done with what we already have. Like, I continue to think about the Afro-American newspaper and how that has completely, the archives has completely transformed, you know, my life. And specifically, they're extensive. They actually covered Liberia very extensively at the Afro-American newspaper, showing that relationship and that conversation that was happening at the time, that not a lot of people was covering that history, right? And so being able to be in that space with Megan, with Jasmine, Savannah, Dion, Bakari, Oyenda, and be able to learn these languages, that I can now go to Liberia with a different perspective of how I understand archives, like, that means something. Yeah. That means something. Yeah.
Thank you all. With that, we're going to turn to the audience for questions and queries. Who would like to start us off?
Thank you. I've been thinking a lot about the Deborah Gray White convening last week and the violence of the art.
Hey, I'm going to give you the mic because they can't pick it up, and I'm not going to be able to relay it.
Hey, I've been thinking a lot about the Deborah Gray White convening last week, which, by the way, Jennifer was generous enough to keynote 2 weeks in a row. Like, she's keynoting 2 weeks in a row. I just want to acknowledge that. And Dinah Ramey Berry and others were, and there was, a whole group of people who were talking about what it means to walk into archives, right? And to pass in archives. And the kind of strategy of survival that we've all had to do. Like, you can't go in and say, hey, I'm a PhD in blah, blah, I got this expertise, right? Like, that lots of people pass as genealogists as a strategy. and how that landed as a strategy rather than an insult, right? Or a strategy more than an insult, and kinfolkology in relationship to that, right? Like that we are kin, and so of course we're genealogists. So it doesn't feel like we're trading anything, right, to say that we're genealogists in the archive. But there's also, I wanted to talk with Kim Gallen often says, right, like I walk into those archives, I can't stand, I'm just going to say this, working at the African American, the Antiquarian Society. I often picture them white people are violent to me, and that they have one black person doesn't make it better to me, right? Like, so I have a hard time being in those archival spaces, and Kim has said over and over again, we need to make the digital spaces more welcoming than the violence of the archival spaces, and that is a place where the actual, the practical, and the imaginative come together in design.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in the question of how we, and it's also because we're honoring the ancestors that we're happy to, the work is more important than who we are, right? It's like we're doing the work with and for them, not for us, right? Like so, and it's a very different approach than the expertise approach. So can we talk about strategies of entry and survival, and as we're working with these collections, right? And what, I guess, Jennifer, you were there, right? Like it's for the whole week I've been struggling with one person after another talking about this kind of way in which you leave your expertise as you bring your expertise, right? And what that means for us.
I'll try to just, so part of what that conversation was about how you navigate the expertise of archival staff who are saying no to you when you come with your, oh, I'm writing a history of women enslaved in South Carolina in 1720. And they're like, oh no, we've got nothing. And you're like, okay. And then you retreat and you figure out another way, right? So that was part of the conversation. And in that regard, some people talked about the fact that because especially in archives in the American South, there's usually a much larger number of people who are there doing genealogical research than there are people who are historians. And so if you kind of pass as a genealogist, the people have had the experience of archival staff being more helpful, frankly. I think that's, so I was thinking about that experience as well as I was listening to the projects that you all spoke about today, because I thought what a thrill it is to just enter into that digital space with no need to cover what you're doing there, right? And to not have to bolster yourself. That's not true. We're still encountering violence. But there's something very uncomfortable and sometimes extraordinarily painful about sitting at a table I do a lot of work in England, so like sitting at a table in the National Archives trying not to cry, right? Because you don't want to be seen in that state, right? And that's something that is an experience that I think many of us have had. And I think that what's so powerful about this question about data is the possibility of a kind of space of connection and ancestral connection, but connection sort of across to the other people who you know are using these sources in the way that you want to use them. It's incredibly exciting and healing, maybe even, a word that I don't usually use when I talk about doing archival research. So I don't know.
I know it's from my perspective, having worked in special collections and manuscript collections that very much fit the mode of an American antiquarian society, that have the Doric columns and portraits of some guy you've never heard of, but he's really staring hard at you on the wall. As someone who's actually done that work and worked with people who perhaps, I wouldn't say any of them necessarily would do this, but who at least might evoke experiences of people who denigrate expertise. I would love to pass on the energy of how little power those people have. Like institutionally, structurally, they have very little power. If someone, and this has not always been true, so I'm 1000% not countering anyone's lived experience, and especially scholars who have been doing this work for a long time. If you write a letter to the university librarian, an email, and say, I am a Black scholar, and I went to your archive, and I was not allowed to do my research, watch yourself come back as a queen of that archive. Why? Because this is a known issue currently. Is that another type of passing and masking? Yeah. But on the flip side, they have so little power and also so little training. One of the reasons why, as you were saying, one of the reasons why saying I'm a genealogist works is because people have very little time to do reference. And so if you say, I know how to answer genealogy reference requests, I do not know how to answer your complicated research request, because very few places have an African Americanist on staff, let alone someone who knows about global anything.
Can I interrupt this for just a second and say there are like 7 chairs right up here. I see people huddled at the back. I feel bad for you. Just come on up. They're set, now they're 6. Now they're 5. Come on up. There's 2 more over here. Come on up. Come on up. Make yourself comfortable. There we go.
But yeah, I mean, that's just, it's hard to impart, but those spaces and their power over you is just so internal.
One more over
Oh,
here.
you're right here, right here.
Here.
Okay. Sorry.
No, that's good.
Okay, thank you.
But it's very inside of yourself, and it's based on the society we live in. It's not inside of yourself because you are sensitive or have more feelings than other people doing research. But frankly, from the work side angle of it, people are crying in archives kind of a lot, and people are crying over stuff that, well, just because I studied my whole life on Emily Dickinson, and now that I'm finally seeing one of her things, I'm having this transportive experience and I'm crying. And we're like, okay, well, don't cry on the Emily Dickinson poem. But I mean, this sort of that there is a trained lack of comfort, a taught lack of comfort in being in these spaces, especially now. But you should see how other patrons respond to archival staff. People love to send in a letter that's like, you cataloged this wrong because I've done my own original research that I won't share with you, but you need to update this record and say it was a totally different person. And so I always do that. Embody the spirit of, oh, I own this. Because those people that work there, I mean, unless you're dealing with somebody whose job title has curator in it, they're not going to feel like they have any power either.
All right, folks, yes.
Hi. So my name is Erica Keynes. I am with the Black Lives for Peace. We have a bunch of stuff back here too, so if y'all want to come and check those things out. But I do have a question from an organizer aspect, because I am not an academic, and just this whole concept is fairly new to me in terms of the question of who owns Black data. So I have 2 questions. To what extent is this accessible for organizers? And I'm thinking about in terms of the work that we do here in Baltimore around the militarization of police. So if we wanted to know about the history, power mapping, and things like that, to what extent is that available to organizers? Do you all work with organizers within your localities? And then my other question really is the question I think Bilphena was raising about the question about ownership. Because I'm thinking about in terms of political power. And without political power, we own nothing, let alone data, not housing, not our safety. So one of the things that we push for is the concept of community control. So to what extent does that kind of overlap with the question about ownership, political power? But then I am really curious about, because Bilphena did talk about Palestine in the archives, to what extent are you do you all reach out or work with organizers? Thank you.
Come on, Black Alliance for Peace. Yeah. So I think, honestly, I can't speak for other archives. I do not, run an archive. But I think part of it, too, so I don't know, maybe you all can speak to how things are where you are, but I think part of being able to work with organizers is back to what I originally stated, and back to what are the political ideologies of the folks that's in the space. And that's why I kept saying the thing of identity politics and control doesn't matter for me if there is no political grounding, right? Because we can control a lot of things and we can own a lot of things. That's why you have Black billionaires, but it didn't make Black life better, right? And so for me, I think that question and being able to say to organizers, the other day in the archives, I saw the petition on behalf of 13 million Negroes across the world, which was something that W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP worked on. And I actually remember sending an image to Erica, and the first thing she said was, so many of us organizers could use this in real time right now, right? And we could use it to build political movements, and we could use it to build political arguments, right? But also, the reason why I moved towards an abolitionist stance when thinking about archives is because a lot of archival spaces are also bound to the state. And so therefore, you are also the work that you're doing, as free as you might think it is for the discourse of empire. And so you think about funding, and you think about fellowships, and you think about how those work. So much of who gets access to those things is dependent on what these institutions feel the story should be. Do they feel the story should be about ethnic cleansing and genocide of Palestinians? Do they feel that they should indict Israel and the U.S. in that? Do they feel that they should have some kind of a challenging of the U.S. military, right? If those institutions and those organizations that house these archives do not actually view that, or that they're not in service of that, how can they tap on organizers, right? And furthermore, I think we have to be honest that a lot of people who work in archives and in data, who go to library school, I'm not one of them, a lot of them, their feet is not in the streets. And I'm not saying that that's a critique, really, because I do believe that we have roles in communities, right? This is part of why I wanted to enter into the Afro, right? I knew that I had a role that I had to play in that archive, and I think that everyone has one, but we have to be honest, very honest, about who gets to control what exactly the archives are doing, even if they think it's free, right? And the last thing I'll say, I think about the Black Panther Party in 1971 when they launched the campaign for sickle cell anemia, right? And I think about the amount of data that they would have needed access to in building this campaign for sickle cell anemia. But I also think about how many archives at that time would have been comfortable standing in solidarity with the Black Panther Party, right? How many archives would have been comfortable with allowing them to come in and see their data and see their numbers in order to build something more robust around how do we answer this question of why so many Black people are dying from something that could be treated? It would require the people there to have a politic and to not be scared of the Black Panther Party. Did they? I don't know, right? And so that's kind of my answer to that.
I'm a university professor, so I teach students. And one of the things that that a lot of the projects talked about was crowdsourcing, the Freedom on the Move project, the Colored Conventions project, working with students and at university level, at secondary level, working with community members, transcribing, right? Learning that process of close reading. And so when you talked about the Du Bois petition, right, and the sense that there's something there that could be useful, and part of what I think that I'm doing in my classes is saying, learn how to read these objects of these tools of control, and learn how to develop a counter narrative out of them. So if you take something that is as appalling, and we saw a couple of those today as a runaway ad. It's an appalling source. And it is a source that tells you about the connection between a man and a woman, about the love that a mother feels for a child. It is a source that tells you that people understand the land on which they live. It is a source that can tell you so much. And so for me, the work of being with students in that process of encouraging them to read slowly and to think carefully about the tools that have been mobilized against people in the past, that feels like a small contribution towards liberation, towards providing the ground on which the circulation of ideas can happen that you're talking about.
Folks, we're transitioning away from our keynote now, but I actually think this is a wonderful point of transition. So I want to say two things. There are many people in this room, so there are a lot of vibrant conversations that can happen before we end this evening. But also on this point of possibility, what is possible where we are? And I think that is key here, right? Each of our speakers today, this keynote conversation, they all exist in very different spaces, right? But what happens when we think about what is possible, right? When we borrow from different spaces, different ideas, but also when we remember what we can do where we are. Because I think one key theme here, right, is how can we empower ourselves to make changes, to do the things, to use our decision-making power, small or large, right? To make something different, to do something different, to think alternate, right? To tap into our radical imagination. So I thank you for this conversation. Please give it up for our keynote conversation.